It's about the real people whose lives have been torn apart by digital abuse, whose privacy has been violated, and it is an issue of human rights violation. It is a violation of right to life, life with dignity. Why do women consent to taking intimate videos, we might ask? But let's be clear, consent to record is not consent to disseminate the videos publicly. No one deserves to have their privacy ripped away and turned into public humiliation. Technologically facilitated sexual violence is a continuation of existing unequal gender norms being reproduced in digital space. The scale of digital crime is overwhelming. A 2024 report from the World Economic Forum found that more than 30% of women worldwide have experienced some forms of technologically facilitated sexual violence, whether it is online harassment, cyber stalking, sextortion, or the non-consensual sharing of intimate images. We all know that technology has changed our life in incredible ways. You just saw when Prime Minister himself launched through the technology, even inaugurated the conference. But it has also made, technology is also being, with all this progress, there is a dark side too. Technology is being used to harass, to exploit, or even to terrorize individuals. And the scary part, law is struggling to keep it up. Investigation, prosecution, and adjudication mechanism is struggling to ensure justice. This situation has been raising concern about accountability, fairness, human rights, and justice. The new age of injustice, a new challenge looms, one that we are only beginning to understand. Technology has created new ways for criminals to operate anonymously across borders at the scale we have never seen before. It is making law enforcement and prosecution more difficult, and we don't act now. If we don't act now, it is only going to get worse. Only last year, European Court of Human Rights ruled in MST's case that failing to investigate and prosecute this crime is a violation of fundamental human rights. And yet, many of our legal systems are still unprepared to tackle these challenges effectively. But I would like to congratulate Mr. Badal for taking leadership, holding this conference in Nepal, and to begin the conversation and bring commitments to deal with this new age challenge. Cybercrime in general is also exploding. Interpol's 2021 Cybercrime Strategy Guidebook reported that 75% of cybercrimes are committed across the borders. Criminals are taking advantage of weak laws, inconsistent regulations, and poor enforcement. The UN reports a 40% increase in cyber stalking cases globally, often linked to domestic violence. Deepfake, AI-generated sexual exploitation, AI is making things even worse. Right now, 96% deepfake contents online is non-consensual pornography. There is no denying that cybersecurity vulnerability plays a huge role in technology-facilitated sexual violence and abuse. Hackers and cyber criminals take advantage of weak security, phishing scams, and hacking techniques to gain access to victims' personal data. In fact, according to Interpol's Cybercrime Strategy Guidebook, over 80% digital sexual offenses are linked to data breaches, malware, and unauthorized system access. A good example is the 2017 US versus Hutchins case, where a security researcher faced legal consequences for creating malware that was later used in cyber exploitation. One of the biggest challenges making technologically facilitated sexual violence worse is the lack of accountability from online platforms. Many tech companies don't enforce strict moderation policies, allowing harmful non-consensual content to spread freely. Nepal is not free from the threat of cybercrime. Internet platforms provide criminals with anonymity coupled with distance proximity. However, with limited policies and regulation and ever-increasing number of offenses carried out online, Nepal's legal institutions, including investigation, prosecution, and adjudication, face several challenges in dealing with cybercrimes. Nepal ranked right now 94 in global cybersecurity index with a score of just 44.99%. The Electric Transaction Act 2008 was written before issues like AI-generated deepfake, pornography, large-scale cyber stalking, and other digital crime became widespread. but we can't afford to lag behind. Justice in the digital age means adapting to new threats before they become unmanageable. As members of the legal and enforcement community, our job is not just to respond to crimes, but it's to prevent them. To fix this issue, we need a stronger legal framework, better international cooperation, the align with global cybersecurity standards, otherwise prosecuting these crimes will continue to be a struggle. And I'm glad that government of Nepal, in the leadership of Prime Minister, has already registered a social media bill in the parliament and in the process to finalize Information Technology and Cybersecurity Bill that will also replace present Electronic Transaction Act. Ability to tackle cybercrime is severely hindered by its limited digital forensic capabilities. Cybercriminals exploit this weakness, knowing that law enforcement lacks the means to track, analyze, and present digital proof effectively. Additionally, the forensic process is further complicated by rapid evolution of technology with new forms of cybercrimes, such as deepfake pornography and AI-generated scams, emerging faster than forensic experts can develop countermeasures. Without urgent investment in the modern forensic labs, continuous training for law enforcement, and robust framework for handling digital evidences, countries risk falling even further behind in the fight against cyber-enabled crimes. Budapest Convention provides a clear framework to claim jurisdiction based on territorial principle, nationality principle, effect doctrines, but jurisdiction alone is not enough. Cybercriminals don't stop at the borders, and neither should justice. That is why extradition and mutual legal assistance are key pillars in dealing with technology-facilitated crime. But for this, bilateral agreements are critical, but reciprocal arrangements are also workable in the absence of bilateral agreement. However, such arrangements is possible only when there is a respective national law for reciprocal arrangements. When it comes to cybercrimes, Budapest Convention is a game changer, but unfortunately it is a European convention. But it still can be a useful reference in our context. Recent adoption of United Nations Convention Against Cybercrime 2024 is a historical achievement. It pushes for stronger laws, better enforcement, and more cooperation between countries to keep the digital world safe. It is time that we call from this conference for the signature and ratification of this new UN Convention Against Cybercrime. The strategy we are looking at is really two-pronged approach, as I said before, anticipation and response. Some countries have already moved forward with national laws that extend their jurisdiction beyond their borders. Take India IT Act, or USA Cloud Act, or UK Online Safety Act, which can be an example for us. But next we have to focus on strengthening the legal infrastructure. Digital evidence is tricky to handle because it can be altered, deleted so easily, so we need to build forensic capacity to ensure that digital evidence can stand up anywhere in the world. Countries like United States have already tackled this with the Violence Against Women Act, which gives better protection against digital harassment and abuse. And the European Union's Digital Service Act is making platforms more accountable by ensuring that non-consensual content is swiftly removed. We should also be pushing for judicial training so that judges can interpret digital evidence and apply the right legal principle to cybercrimes, even setting up a specialized code for cyber crimes similar to UK's Online Harm Act or India's Cyber Appellate Tribunal could be a game changer in speeding up and for effective justice. Lastly, we have platform liability. Companies like Meta, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram need to register in our local domestic countries and follow the local laws. A directive has already been issued by the Supreme Court of Nepal in the TikTok ban case in this regard. We need stricter rules for platform accountability when it comes to spread of harmful content, especially AI-based content moderation. For instance, content. And I would also like to share two judgments from Nepal. With the advancement of technology, issues of privacy, data security, and online safety are becoming more pressing. In Baburam Aryal's case, the Supreme Court of Nepal emphasized that personal data, communication, and documentation must remain inviolable except as permitted by law. This requirement was largely criticized by the Law Investigation Authority. As a result, the court has also developed a guideline to facilitate the case, facilitate in certain situation to get the data. And in Pratyush Nath Want's case, the Supreme Court also viewed that right to freedom of thought and expression is not absolute, and reasonable restrictions can be imposed. However, this restriction must be clearly defined, justified, and proportionate, ensuring that they do not unnecessarily limit fundamental freedoms. So to sum up it, the key to this strategy is preparation and proactive, strengthening the proactive measures, whether it is through harmonizing international law or strengthening local legal infrastructure or holding platforms accountable. We have to build a framework that can not only respond to the challenges of digital age, but stay one step ahead of them. I want to recall what the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, said. He had warned that AI lacks adaptability. When human oversight is lost, makes transparency and accountability difficult to ensure. Without clear legal framework and infringe upon fundamental rights, addressing this risk requires strong transparency measures, disclosure obligation, and robust data protection laws, along with effective legal remedies for the violation. We must shift from reactive to proactive in our legal and judicial approach to technologically facilitate sexual violence and cybersecurity crime. Too often, legal reforms occur only after widespread harm has already been inflicted. We can no longer afford to wait. The time for action is now. Honorable Prime Minister, the pursuit of justice in the digital age is not optional. It is imperative. We cannot allow technology to become a tool of oppression, harassment, or exploitation. Instead, we must harness its potential to strengthen legal potential protections, enhance enforcement capabilities, and empower individuals to navigate digital space safely. The judiciary has always played a critical role in shaping societies. Today, our role extends beyond the physical courtrooms into a realm of cyberspace. Therefore, I want to call all the delegates, the choices today we make now, whether to modernize our laws, strengthen enforcement mechanism, and uphold the rights of victims, will determine whether we succeed or fail in protecting justice in the digital era. Let this conference serve not only a platform for discussion, but as a catalyst for change. Let us leave here with a shared commitment to ensuring that our laws reflect the realities, experiences, and need of the 21st century, that perpetrators of digital crimes are held accountable, and victims find justice without delay. Justice means not only to criminalize offender, but also repairing the harm with compensation to the victim. With a united legal community, modernized and equipped cyber bureaus, trained and dedicated enforcement agency, and now a proactive judiciary, strong forensic agencies, and empowered and informed societies, we can build a digital future where justice prevails, where the rule of law extends beyond borders, and where technology serves as a force for good rather than harm. I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the Attorney General of Nepal and his team for organizing this significant conference successfully. But more importantly, I just saw a representative of UNODC. Your continuous engagement in strengthening rule of law and bringing due diligence in this regard is very, very important, and we hope you will continue doing that. Thank you for making me part of this conference.
Thank you very much for your enlightening keynote address, Madam Justice. Next, it is my great honor to invite our esteemed special guest, General Counsel, International Association of Prosecutors, Ms. Shehnaz Muzaffar, to deliver her address. Madam, please.
Honourable Prime Minister, Honourable Supreme Court Justice, Honourable Attorney General, Excellencies, distinguished guests and colleagues, good morning. It's a pleasure and an honour to be here in Kathmandu for this important conference on crimes of the digital age, a challenge that affects us all. I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to the Honourable Attorney General for the invitation to attend this event and for the wonderful warmth and hospitality that's been extended to us all by the conference organising team. The evolution of digital technologies has facilitated the commission of new forms of sexual violence and abuse and created new mechanisms for committing traditional such offences, frequently against women and children. Criminal activity committed with the use of technology can have significant and long-lasting psychological and social consequences for victims. As technological growth continues at pace, prosecutors, investigators, and lawmakers must develop a multi-pronged approach that includes enhanced international cooperation, cross-sector collaboration, increased training and education, and effective support for victims and witnesses to enable these crimes to be tackled effectively. So what do we mean when we talk about technology-facilitated sexual violence and abuse? There's no agreed definition of the term, but it refers to any situation where digital technology is used to facilitate or enable either virtual or face-to-face sexually based harms. These harms can include sextortion, online stalking and harassment, online sexual exploitation, image-based sexual abuse, and the commission of sexual offences, including rape, following online grooming. Common technologies used to perpetrate technology-facilitated sexual violence and abuse include, of course, emails, text messages, messaging apps, social media sites, and social networking platforms, but also technologies like GPS, and geo-positioning data that's used by victims and spyware estimated. The challenges posed to law enforcement and prosecutors in investigating and prosecuting offences of sexual violence and abuse committed in part or in full by the use of technology are vast. Criminals can commit offences against victims in a different jurisdiction to themselves without ever meeting them. And as technology continues to develop, so too does the ability of criminals to exploit that technology for nefarious purposes. The malicious use of deepfakes is just one example of that. To give an idea of the scale of the challenge faced, NCMEC, that is the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children based in the US, received more than 32 million reports of suspected child exploitation, sexual exploitation, in 2023 alone, a rise of 12% from the previous year. Most of those reports related to the circulation of child sexual abuse material, but there was a continued rise in reports as well of financial sextortion and increasing concern relating to the use of generative AI in child sexual exploitation. So let's turn then to prosecutors. As just mentioned, the sheer scale of criminal activity far exceeds the capability of law enforcement to adequately respond, particularly given the likely percentage of underreporting that takes place. Criminals are adept at concealing their online criminal activity through the use of VPNs, encryption, peer-to-peer sharing networks, and the dark web, all of which pose additional investigative difficulties for police. The challenges are not just faced by law enforcement. Prosecutors too are facing exceedingly high caseloads, and backlogs in the court system can dissuade victims from coming forward to make a complaint or mean that they disengage from the criminal justice process because of the length of time that any investigation or prosecution may take. A second challenge, as we've just heard, relates to outdated or insufficient legislation. In many jurisdictions, the law has not kept pace with the changing nature of technology, meaning that many statutory frameworks are inadequate and unsuited to dealing with offending that's committed via the use of technology. When statutory reform does happen, it's frequently slow and subject to other competing political pressures and priorities. A further issue is the significant reliance that's often required on digital evidence to properly investigate and prosecute technology-facilitated sexual violence and abuse. As we're all aware from our experience, obtaining material from service providers for use evidentially is frequently a slow and resource-intensive process, particularly when the formal mutual legal assistance process needs to be used. Requests are often simply not answered or answered incompletely, or when a request is received, it may be too late for the evidence to be used in any proceedings. The inability to obtain content data from encrypted applications, even when the correct legal standard is met, also significantly thwarts the investigative capabilities of law enforcement. In some cases, this means that a prosecution cannot be taken forward. In others, it means that the fact finder does not necessarily have a full picture of all relevant information in a case. An example of this very recently can be seen in a case from the United Kingdom, albeit not a technology-facilitated sexual violence or abuse case. In January this year, Axel Rudakabana pleaded guilty to the murder of 3 children at a dance class in Southport in July 2024. He'd cleared his internet history, save for one search immediately prior to the attack. Evidence of his internet usage could provide vital information to law enforcement about his motives, and yet the officer in charge of the case has said that it will take investigators years to access his search history via the formal court processes. And the final challenge that I want to mention is perhaps one that's become only more recently recognised, and that's the impact on investigators and prosecutors of constant exposure to offences of sexual abuse and violence facilitated by technology. Images of sexual abuse, particularly those involving children, are exceptionally harrowing and distressing, and victims in these cases may be particularly vulnerable. Vicarious trauma, that is the impact of exposure to somebody else's trauma, impacts on the mental well-being of prosecutors and investigators and their ability to do their job effectively, and risks leading to higher attrition rates. And so what then are the potential solutions? The first is that the legal framework in each jurisdiction needs to evolve consistently and without delay to ensure that prosecutors have a sound basis to prosecute technology-facilitated sexual violence and abuse, and that on conviction there are adequate sentencing powers. For example, the UK's Online Safety Act of 2023 introduced, amongst other offences, an offence of cyberflashing, that is the sending of unsolicited sexual images to another online or via data sharing services such as Bluetooth. And it also criminalised the sharing of AI-generated intimate images without consent. The UK government has also announced an intention to make the creation of sexually explicit deepfake images, that is, images that have been digitally manipulated to create new digital recordings, a criminal offence punishable by a term of imprisonment. As well as providing a clear legal framework to prosecute these offences, it means that a strong public message is also sent that such behaviour is not just wholly unacceptable, but is also criminal. This links to the second consideration, which is the need for increased public awareness and education about technology-facilitated sexual violence and abuse. This is twofold, both in relation to increasing public awareness of the risks of sharing information online, but also in educating the public of the consequences to other individuals and to themselves of engaging in this kind of behaviour. There's also the related need to reduce the perceived stigma of being a victim of these offences, which can dissuade individuals from coming forward to make complaints. Thirdly is the need for enhanced investment in law enforcement and prosecution agencies. Specialised units and targeted training can ensure that criminal justice actors are better prepared and able to deal with traumatised victims and witnesses. And increased resources ensure that prosecutors and investigators are also better equipped with the tools that they need to properly conduct criminal cases. It's also vitally important that prosecutorial agencies have sufficient support mechanisms in place to ensure that the mental well-being of prosecutors who are exposed to graphic and emotionally challenging material on a daily basis is protected. More use should be made of multidisciplinary teams with closer collaboration between law enforcement and prosecutors, and more engagement where appropriate with medical services and social or protection services. Victims who are going through the criminal justice system must feel listened to, supported, informed, and have the right to be treated fairly and properly. And finally, there's the need for enhanced, more efficient, effective international cooperation. This is of particular importance when dealing with offences facilitated by technology, as the victim will frequently be in another jurisdiction to the offender. And so assistance will need to be sought from foreign partners to ensure that a case is evidentially sound. It's a widely recognised view that the formal mutual legal assistance process is too slow, resource-intensive and cumbersome. Against that backdrop, the importance of informal cooperation cannot be overstated. As prosecutors, we need to make better use of informal networks and of international organisations such as the IACCC, Eurojust, ICAR and others. We need to reduce bureaucracy, for example, by allowing for the direct transmission of requests rather than through diplomatic channels. And we need to ensure that international inquiries feature prominently at the start of an investigation, rather than as an afterthought only in the run-up to trial. May I turn then to the second part of this presentation, which is about putting victims at the heart of the criminal justice process. And really it builds on the comments made by the previous speaker in relation to not forgetting the importance of victims in this process and recognising the severe impact that these types of offences will have on both victims and witnesses. The topics that I propose to cover over the next 10 minutes or so are trauma-informed practices, victimless prosecutions and a victim's code, all of which are highly relevant to dealing with victims of technology-facilitated sexual violence and abuse, but also victims of other forms of criminal activity as well. As we all know, victims and witnesses play an integral role in the criminal justice system, and there's an increased focus on the interaction between law enforcement, prosecutors, and victims and witnesses, and a heightened focus on how we as criminal justice practitioners can ensure that victims and witnesses are able to give their best evidence. Before we look at the concept of trauma-informed practices, I'd like to start with some very brief context. There's a growing awareness that the multiple ways in which victims and witnesses experience the criminal justice system can exacerbate the impact of prior experiences of trauma, which then has a negative impact on their ability to effectively participate in the criminal justice process and can also hamper their recovery. It's vitally important that prosecutors and all professionals who come into contact with victims and witnesses have an understanding of the impact of trauma of these types of offences and are aware of mechanisms that can be used to minimise the risk of re-traumatisation and ensure that the best evidence can be obtained from witnesses affected by trauma. It's obviously also important that those objectives are met without compromising the fairness of a trial and within the constraints of existing evidential requirements and processes. The first question is, how do we define the concept of trauma? There's no fixed definition in this concept, but it can be described as an incident or series of incidents that are physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening to an individual. Trauma can affect people in different ways and can have lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning and their mental, physical, and emotional well-being. That's particularly relevant in the context of criminal proceedings for three reasons. Firstly, it can also impact the way in which someone's memories are stored and recalled, the way in which somebody copes with particular times of stress, and the ability of an individual to provide a coherent account of events. Secondly, it can also mean that individuals are highly sensitive to reminders of previous traumatic experiences, which can trigger intrusive trauma memories, a sense of it happening again. Some elements of the criminal justice process will inevitably and necessarily involve recalling, and in some cases reliving traumatic events, and prosecutors need to be aware of the impact of that process. And thirdly, because trauma can have significant effects on mental health, people affected by trauma, victims and witnesses, may not engage with or may drop out of the criminal justice process. And so what does a trauma-informed approach by investigators and prosecutors look like? Firstly, it involves understanding what trauma is, how trauma can arise, what the signs are, and how it can affect people in different ways. For example, someone who's undergone a traumatic event such as a sexual assault, or who has had intimate photos taken without their consent circulated online, may feel shame or a mistaken sense of responsibility, which can impact on their ability or desire to disclose that they've been a victim of crime. Witnesses may use different ways to cope with the impacts of trauma, which could be mistaken as an indicator of poor credibility, for example. It's therefore important that prosecutors understand how trauma can affect a witness's evidence, how it's delivered, and how it's interpreted. Secondly, a trauma-informed approach involves avoiding re-traumatization if possible. It's recognised that there's an unavoidable risk of re-traumatization in any situation where someone is asked to recall and talk about a traumatic event, as will inevitably happen when a witness is required to give evidence. And it's also recognised that certain adaptations may not be possible because of the need to adhere to the rules of evidence and to protect the right of an accused to a fair trial. However, there are steps that can be taken to mitigate the risk of re-traumatization, such as ensuring that a witness is fully informed at every stage of the proceedings as to what is happening with their case, and reducing potential triggers to re-traumatization, such as proximity to the accused at trial. Thirdly, this type of approach involves supporting recovery from the impact of trauma where possible. As prosecutors, we of course don't have an explicit role in delivering care or in supporting recovery from a medical or therapeutic perspective. However, we can consider the ways in which we can adapt how we carry out our role, such as how we question a witness, to minimise the risk of inhibiting their recovery. Fourthly, a trauma-informed approach will seek to uphold the rights of witnesses affected by trauma to equal and effective participation in the legal process. The focus of this aim in a justice setting is on measures that can be taken to enable witnesses to participate and stay engaged in the criminal justice process and to give the best evidence that they can. There are multiple ways in which this can be done, including keeping them informed of the process and any changes such as the granting of bail. It may also include practical considerations, such as ensuring that the victim and an accused are not waiting in the same court in advance of a trial. And finally, a trauma-informed approach will integrate an understanding of trauma into organisational policy and practice, meaning that those who lead organisations need systems in place to support the approach that's delivered by frontline staff. Part of that includes supporting the reliance of the prosecutorial workforce and reducing the impact of vicarious trauma on staff who are frequently exposed to evidence and narrative that relates to traumatic events, so that those who engage with victims and witnesses have a capacity to maintain an empathetic stance. And so in conclusion, in dealing with trauma-informed approaches, the fair access to justice must be underpinned by a judicial system which allows victims of crime to fully participate and give evidence in a process that minimises contributing to further trauma or harm. Victims and witnesses are critical to the criminal justice system, and so we as prosecutors need to ensure that we support their full engagement whilst also upholding the rights of an accused to the fair trial. The importance of the topics that I've touched on today are enshrined in the IEP standards, known in full as the IEP standards of professional responsibility and statement of the essential duties and rights of prosecutors. The IEP standards were adopted by my organisation, the International Association of Prosecutors, in 1999, and so they are now 26 years old. They recognise that prosecutors have a fundamental role to play in the administration of justice. The IEP standards act as a benchmark for the way in which prosecutors should conduct themselves in their work, and they also set out the responsibility of prosecution services towards prosecutors. They're standards that each of us should adhere to in every aspect of our professional role. They were written by prosecutors, not by states or governments, and so they are directly relevant to us. They were recognised by the UN in 2008, and so they are internationally recognised standards for prosecutors, and I would encourage everybody here to review them. Of particular note for these purposes is Article 4.3. That article overtly highlights the importance of considering the interests and concerns of victims and witnesses, and of ensuring that they're informed of their rights. The article also stresses the importance of balancing those rights with the requirements of a fair trial. Nothing that I'm saying here today should undermine the rights of the accused in that context. May I turn very briefly then to victimless prosecutions. Victimless prosecutions are also known as evidence-based prosecutions, although that's a slightly misleading name because every prosecution, of course, has to be evidence-based. The fact that they're termed as victimless does not mean that there is no victim, but rather they are prosecutions that occur when either a victim is unwilling or unable to give evidence, and where there's no evidence therefore directly adduced from a victim at trial. And again, that's particularly relevant in these types of offending that's committed online, potentially where a victim, because of a feeling of shame, for example, is not prepared to engage with the criminal justice process. In order for a victimless prosecution to take place, it still has to be in the public interest to continue with a prosecution without a victim. And so in jurisdictions where there's a code for prosecutors, for example, they must still be met. The evidence in a victimless prosecution will come from other sources, such as CCTV, contemporaneous records, other eyewitness accounts, phone and email data, or evidence from the accused themselves. These cases also arise frequently in cases of domestic abuse and also human trafficking. Proceeding with a case without a victim requires a more holistic approach to case building, as the starting point is to build a case evidentially that does not need to rely on direct evidence from a victim. To this end, efforts should be made to gather evidence so that the prosecution case is not focused solely on a complainant's statement. Guidance from my own prosecuting authority in England informs prosecutors that we should not assume that the only way to prove a case is by the victim giving evidence at court. We must routinely consider whether there's other evidence, independent of the victim, that supports the prosecution case and upon which a prosecution can be built. The emphasis is on joint working by police officers and prosecutors to build cases that can be prosecuted without the victim's participation. In order to do so, other evidence must be gathered, and prosecutors must seek to use this material wherever permissible by their legal frameworks. All of this means that if cases can still be built without over-reliance on a victim, then it's still possible for a prosecution to proceed, either where a victim does not engage from the outset or where they are initially supportive but withdraw their support at a later stage. Following a victim-centred approach can sometimes mean making a difficult decision about whether to proceed without victim testimony or cooperation, because that is what's best for the victim and achieving justice in a case. It's good practice, particularly in domestic violence and GBV cases, or in cases of human trafficking, to ensure as investigators and prosecutors that we look to see whether we can prove our case to the required standard without adducing direct testimony from witnesses. We must always look to what corroborating evidence is available, even if the victim is not engaged. I had hoped to cover very briefly Victims' Code and Victims' Right to Review, but I'm very conscious that I'm about to run out of time for my session, and so I'll move just to a couple of very brief concluding remarks, if I may. Tackling technology-facilitated sexual violence and abuse requires a holistic approach that includes robust statutory frameworks, multi-agency collaboration, increased training and specialism, more resources, enhanced international cooperation, and effective support for victims and witnesses. Given the transnational nature of many of these crimes, we have to work more efficiently, effectively, and closely with our counterparts around the world, both within investigative and prosecutorial agencies, to meet the challenges that we all face head-on. We have to do that to make our community safer, to protect the most vulnerable, and to ensure that those who commit these serious and heinous crimes are brought to justice in accordance with the operation of the rule of law. I very much look forward to the constructive discussions and presentations that we will have over the next 2 days, and to meaningful outcomes that will enable us all to better tackle these types of technology-facilitated sexual violence and abuse offences. But for now, thank you again, Honourable Attorney General, for the very kind invitation to attend this conference and to participate by delivering this address this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your enlightening keynote address, Ms. Shehnaz. May I now respectfully invite our guest of honor, Right Honorable Prime Minister of Nepal, to grace us with his inaugural remarks. Right Honorable Prime Minister, we are truly honored by your presence, and we eagerly look forward to your words of wisdom.
यस कार्यक्रमका अध्यक्ष माननीय महान्यायाधिवक्ता रमेश बडालज्यू, विष्णु रिमालज्यू, उद्घाटन समारोहका विशेष वक्ता सर्वोच्च अदालतका माननीय न्यायाधीश सपना प्रधान मल्लज्यू, Keynote speaker, नाम बिर्सी मैले, Shehnaz, Shehnaz मुजफ्फरज्यू र सम्पूर्ण यहाँ उपस्थित भएका साथीहरू, आज खुसीको कुरा हो तपाईहरू कसरी आजको जटिल अवस्थामा न्यायका लागिको अनुसन्धान अभियोजनलाई प्रभावकारी बनाउने र सफल बनाउने भन्ने सन्दर्भमा